According to Christians, the Bible which you and I read today is the product of God Himself, who inspired men like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Paul, to write out His inspired word, recording the life and the teachings of Jesus Christ, which was then assembled into our modern day Bibles. According to skeptics, on the other hand, the modern Bible is the product not of God's actions, inspiring writers in the 1st century, but rather of human beings in the 4th century, as the church hierarchy looked back on allegedly, a big pile of different gospels, different competing religious traditions, different Christian truths. And they picked and chose and decided which narratives they wanted to defend, which ones they wanted to be official Christian truth, and for political reasons picked those. And that, skeptics say, is where you and I get our modern Bible, the actions of a political church hierarchy, rather than of God, inspiring and then moving His church to recognize His inspired scripture. Well, which is the correct hypothesis? Which is the correct understanding of what really happened? There's a whole tremendous amount of different pieces of evidence we can look at, which do support the Christian picture, the picture of God inspiring and then moving His church to recognize His inspired scriptures. But today I want to focus on one particular, rather interesting bit of evidence, which is actually courtesy of a heretic. This heretic is a man named Marcion. Now it's pronounced Marcion, it's actually spelled M-A-R-C-I-O-N. And Marcion did something in the 140s AD, so about 100 years, a little more than 100 years after Christ's death and resurrection. Marcion did something which gives us a very helpful snapshot of the religious teaching, the religious writings, which were available to Christians in his day. So Marcion had a variety of different, heretical views. Among other things, he believed that there were actually two gods, that the God of the Old Testament was a lesser, lower deity than the God of the New Testament, who's different. And he had various other unorthodox views. Well, Marcion, in defending his views, published a list of the religious writings which he believed were inspired by God. In other words, the religious writings which he accepted as scripture. And his list included the Gospel of Luke and then 10 of Paul's epistles. So those were the only writings from what we would call the New Testament today, which Marcion accepted. And in fact, he edited those very heavily to make them fit his bizarre beliefs. Well, why is that significant to us? What can that tell us? After all, he's a heretic. He doesn't even hold to Orthodox Christianity. But actually, that is exactly why Marcion's list is so revealing. Because remember, Marcion is looking to support his own unorthodox views. And that's why he has to edit so heavily even those few books of the New Testament which he does prefer to speak of as scripture, which he recognizes as scripture, because he can edit them to fit his purposes. Well, if that's the kind of view he's supporting, what's interesting is if we look back at the so-called Gnostic Gospels, the various other Gnostic writings from the 2nd century, right around Marcion's time, if we look at those that have been discovered, that are supposed to be these other competing Gospels, that the church just arbitrarily chose not to listen to. Well, if we look at those writings, what we find is that those writings support Marcion's views, many of them do, support Marcion's views a lot more cleanly than either Luke or the epistles of Paul that were the only items that he included on his list of inspired scripture that he accepted. What does that tell us then? Again, this gives us a snapshot of what the Christian community that Marcion was trying to appeal to and persuade, what the Christian community of his day accepted as religious writings, accepted as inspired scripture. And we do know that the Christian church, even of that day, was already thinking of the core of the New Testament as scripture. Well, what does this show us? It shows us that when Marcion went looking for religious writing to use to support his views, his only options were writings that are today in the New Testament. If he could have gone to the Gnostic Gospels and brought in this other Gnostic teaching that better fit his views, he would have. But in 140, roughly 140, 150, in that decade, AD, in that period when he's publishing this list, what it tells us with this snapshot is that in that era, the only books he could credibly appeal to were books that are presently in the New Testament. Whether some of the Gnostic writings didn't even exist in that day, or whether they were just recognized widely as heresies and nobody took them seriously, and appealing to them would have undermined Marcion's credibility, it's not clear which it was. But it seems like those are the only two good reasons why he wouldn't have bothered appealing to these religious writings, which better supported his point of view. So what's the takeaway for you and me? When we hear somebody say, well, why did the church not accept these other, Gnostic teachings? Why did they choose these, what are today the canonical Gospels, the canonical writings that make up our New Testament? The answer is because we look back to the early church, to the writings that came from the apostles and those who worked with and were taught by the apostles. And what we see through evidence like Marcion is that the only credible, legitimate, authoritative writing that was accepted by, disseminated by, that was the teachings of that first century church, it's the writings that are today in our New Testament. And the so-called Gnostic Gospels, they came later. They were not written by the apostles or those who were taught by the apostles. And they were not treated as credible by those who actually knew their authorship, who actually knew the teachings of the apostles. They ignored them, which is why even a heretic like Marcion had to do the same, and why you and I today, as we read our New Testament, can safely do the same as well.